All right, everybody. So let's get started. I want to start out by welcoming all of you to the first of what is going to be initially at least five sessions on empirical household finance, topics in empirical household finance. My name is Johannes Ströbel. I'm a professor at NYU Stern. And together with my colleague Teresa, who's also a panelist, we teach a household finance class at the PhD level at NYU Stern, and we thought that this year, given the remote nature of essentially all teaching anyways, we thought that we would try and experiment, and we thought we'd try and experiment in two directions. The first direction is, rather than us sort of presenting a lot of research that other people in the field have done, we thought, well, if everything's going to be remote, we might as well ask, the people whose research we would talk about in the class to actually, dial in and present it themselves. And the second direction in which we thought we would experiment this year was to see if, rather than limiting this to the students who are formally enrolled in the class, we would take a subset of our teaching, particularly these sessions where we would invite outside speakers and open them up to sort of the broader research community, PhD students, researchers, faculty, pre-docs, postdocs, whatever you might be doing from around the world. And so it's fantastic to see that so many of you have joined us for today's class. So the objective for today's class, or for my presentation today, is going to be threefold. So I'm going to begin the class by talking about household finance as a research field. And there's going to be a broader introductory set of comments that I have about somewhat the history of household finance, the types of topics that you would think about, the types of methods and tools that you would use, etc. And I'm only going to do that today. The other sessions, I'm going to assume that you guys have seen this initial introduction. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the topic that is going to be the focus of today's class. So as you guys all know, today's class is going to focus on consumer credit and household borrowing behavior, but it's going to focus on household borrowing behavior in the non-mortgage space. As you know, we have another class in a few weeks where we're going to specifically look at mortgages. So I'll try and sort of add some general observations on this topic, the types of questions within this topic that people find interesting, and sort of trying to provide a little bit of framework to the subsequent presentations that come. And then I'm going to close out with presenting a research paper of mine in this space, regulating consumer financial products, evidence from credit cards. And after that, Teresa will talk about some of her research. And then we have a number of fantastic panelists who will each come and spend 30 minutes teaching them about a research paper that they've worked on in the past, that each of them in this non-mortgage household borrowing space, and then we're going to close out with a panel discussion that includes all or most of the individual presenters, where we'll discuss sort of more broadly the questions, what are sort of research directions, what are unanswered questions, what do we think are sort of the most interesting directions in which to take this topic. Okay, so I'm going to start out talking a little bit about household finance as a field. So when I was a graduate student, household finance as a field didn't really quite exist. So traditionally, research and finance department was organized, to be either within the field of within the field of corporate finance, or within the field of asset pricing. This sort of idea that you could specialize in household finance as a subfield wasn't really around, 10, 12 years ago. And the first time that household finance got onto the big stage was when John Campbell gave his presidential address at the American Finance Association in 2006. John Campbell has done seminal work across a whole range of fields, probably most prominently in asset pricing, and yet he chose the opportunity to give the presidential address to talk about this new field of household finance, the question of how do households use financial instruments to attain their objectives. And in one of what ended up being one of the first survey articles of the field of household finance by Guizo and Sudini. They described this and they said, look, at the time of the address, so in 2006, household finance had not yet earned its own title and identity. But today, household finance is a thriving, vibrant, and self-standing field. And you can really see that on a lot of measures. I think just one of them that I think might be particularly relevant to the PhD students amongst you is that if you look at the job market, the finance academic job market over the past few years, it actually, many of the most successful candidates on the job market were broadly working on this this field of household finance, and you'll get to meet some of them in the later sessions today and also in subsequent sessions down the road. But really, in some sense, because it is a new field, there's some sort of first order questions to which we don't really have a good answer yet. And as a result, I think there's a lot of scope for interesting questions and high impact papers to be written, and you can see that, and that is reflected in the fact that a lot of the people working in this field, PhD students working in that field, who then go out onto the job market, end up doing very well. There obviously seems to be demand from universities, from finance groups, but also econ departments to hire people working in this field. So why household finance? Why, is this research that we do, why does it need or deserve its own sort of subfield rather than being grouped either with corporate finance or asset pricing? I think one good reason for this is the fact that households are special on many dimensions, and a lot of these dimensions will play a central role in many of the papers we'll see through the sequence. So one dimension in which households are special is they plan over long but finite horizons. So unlike firms, that live infinitely, households have these sort of finite horizons with very well-defined life cycle patterns of income. So early on in your life, you don't earn any income, but you spend, and so you need to borrow. So for example, if you're a college student, you need to take out student loans in order to borrow. Then, over your productive working life, you earn and you save and you accumulate assets. And then in the end, you go into retirement in which your income goes down again. And so again, there's this large need to save for retirement while you're working. And again, that's sort of something that's very special about households. So this life cycle patterns of income introduce some very interesting problems that make households special from, say, firms or other economic players. There's a second aspect of households that makes them very special, which is that households have a very important non-traded asset, which is human capital. In fact, for most of you, human capital will be the most valuable asset that you own, and yet you can't trade it, and it's very hard to borrow against. And so that is going to introduce some interesting aspects to studying households that are not there, for other firms or something like that. A third thing that makes households special is that besides this large non-traded asset, for almost all households, the second largest asset they own, housing, is extremely illiquid too, right? And so you see that, topics around financing of housing and mortgages, etc., and you're going to spend a full session on, because it's really been a large focus of the research efforts. But that's really to a large extent because it is so important and it is really quite unique again. Then there's something that kind of plays an important role in all of these, which is there's obvious constraints on the ability of households to borrow. So for example, human capital is not a very easily collateralizable asset. And then there's also important information frictions, in the lending markets between households and banks. And the information frictions with households are probably even more important than when you think about information frictions when firms want to go and borrow. And so again, the combination of lack of collateral and strong information frictions induces constraints on the ability to borrow, and that makes households somewhat special as well. The fifth point, and I think this is probably almost the most important one in terms of understanding why household finance has been able to develop as a separate field to asset pricing and corporate finance, is that while there is behavioral corporate finance and there is behavioral asset pricing, most of the standard ways that people in these literatures think about the behavior of investors or the behavior of firms, etc., assume that those players behave in an intrinsically rational way. Now again, There's been work to show dimensions where this isn't the case. But with households, the rational behavior, falls apart very, very quickly. And as we'll see in essentially all presentations today, is that these households are subject to very important behavioral biases. So Teresa's presentation later will show how time inconsistent preferences help us better explain household behavior. When households make these intertemporal decisions about how to invest, how to borrow, etc., the beliefs that they form about the future naturally play a really, really important role in affecting their behavior today. And when you look at the data, it turns out that the way that these beliefs are formed deviate in very important ways from sort of the rational framework that we assume in many of our models. And we're going to have a specific class really digging and diving into understanding the deviations of actual belief formation from rational belief formation. But really the fact that households' behavior deviates in important and pervasive ways from the rational behavior, I think is something that really makes households special compared with investors or compared with firms. And again, it's, I think, a good reason of why we, have established or working to establish this as a separate field. And then the last topic, and this isn't unique to household, but it's really important within the field of household finance, is that households and sort of the markets of financial products used by households are subject to pretty substantial regulation of the producers, say the banks or the pension funds and something else. And so, I'm going to talk in my presentation today about, regulating consumer financial products. But, just to kind of give you a little bit of a preview to understand why this regulation is so pervasive, what you really need to understand is that, this interaction with the previous point, which is that, to the extent that households have these behavioral biases and that they do make mistakes, that really then introduces a substantial scope for regulation to improve the welfare of households. Why do we care about households? Well, I think the first one is in some sense, to me, the most obvious one, which has got important welfare implications, right? So most, social welfare functions that you would write down, the primitives in these social welfare functions are the actual, utilities of the households. And so, it seems natural to us that it's important to study them. When you study, say, firms, from a social welfare perspective, why we care about firms is really only, to the extent that the behavior of firms down the road might also affect then the welfare of individuals and households. Secondly, we're talking about large magnitudes, right? So today is going to be about consumer credit. The totality of US total household debt is approximately equal in size to the totality of total corporate debt. And then lastly, and I think just sort of in terms of understanding, the timing of when household finance became this sort of hot research field, is that the most recent financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, many narratives of that crisis put household behavior, household borrowing, and household balance sheets really at the heart of the causes of that crisis. And so, this is how certainly Teresa and I got interested in this. We were in grad school in 2008, 2009, just as the financial crisis was unfolding. And, we started to realize, like many people around us, that we didn't really understand the behavior of households, say, in the mortgage market nearly enough as we should, compared to the importance of that behavior in precipitating, this extremely large economic shock. You will see that we called the class empirical household finance rather than household finance. And, so the question is why this focus on empirical work? I think the focus on empirical work, to me, and it's not unique, and people are doing theory work within this household finance space, but for me, the reason for the focus on empirical work is that actually the optimal household behavior, how households should behave in these markets, is usually pretty well established in related fields, say labor, IO, macro, contract theory. But what's really important is once you start looking at the data, the empirical findings that you get about how households behave is often, usually I would even say, inconsistent with sort of these theories of optimal behavior that you would write down. And so these insights from behavioral economics become important. Now, once you move away from the rational framework, it's actually quite tricky to think about alternative ways of modeling this. Different behavioral theories are sometimes hard to distinguish, are sometimes observationally equivalent, but they lead to very different policy and welfare implications. And so in order to distinguish, once you think, well, the rational model doesn't seem to describe, particular actions very well, from that point onwards, when you're trying to then understand, what alternative models might perform better, really data is going to be particularly helpful. Now, when I say empirical household finance, I want to emphasize that, within this empirical umbrella, there's scope both for, very reduced form work, along the lines of the paper that I'll be presenting today, but actually also a lot of scope for much more structural modeling or structural estimation approaches. So Scott Nelson's paper, which we'll see down the road, is one example here. So when you do work in empirical household finance, what do you need? I mean, this is sort of, 3 bullet points that are all in some sense obvious. The first thing you need is an interesting question. The second thing you need is an empirical strategy and an economic or econometric framework. And the third thing you need is data. And these are all obvious bullet points, but I really want to bring them up at this specific moment here, because I think if you keep these 3 points in mind as we sort of go through the presentations that we'll see throughout the day, I think that's going to be very useful for you to kind of try and figure out for each of the papers, well, what is the question? What is the empirical strategy? What is the economic framework they're thinking through? And what is the data? And so, I think it helps me when I read other papers or when I see other papers to try and sort of, really try and map it into these 3 points here to try and help me understand why a particular paper is sort of very successful or why it might not be very successful. And so I think, focusing on these 3 issues during the upcoming presentations, I think will give you a helpful framework. So there's one way to think about questions, right? And I think really the point of putting these five sessions together for us was really to introduce you to sort of the types of questions that people are working at. But one way to try and structure the various papers and the various presentations that we're going to see is by thinking about households in some sense somewhat analogous to firms. Think about households as having a household balance sheet on which they have assets on one side and which they have liabilities on the other side, right? So we talked up front that human capital is sort of the most important asset that households have. And then there's this matched liability of student loans. And so you could think about, an entire sub-literature of household finance studying the interaction of student loans and human capital, and how sort of, frictions in the credit market and the student loan market might affect households' ability to invest in human capital, etc. Then on the tangible asset side, you have a bunch of important categories. I mean, one of them is just investments. And I think traditionally, people started thinking about household finance when they were thinking of portfolio allocation. Right, so we're trying to write down models of portfolio allocation. How do investors, diversify? How do they, hedge certain risks, etc. And so households have those same incentives, and so you can think about the investment behavior of households. The closely related one, and it really is an investment behavior too, but one that that is affected by a lot of regulation, is retirement savings. Right, so here we come back to this life cycle aspect. During your working life, you earn more than you spend, and you somehow have to take that money and transfer it over to the to your retirement period. How do you optimally do that? And this is a market where there's lots of tax incentives, where there's lots of sort of other regulatory interventions in this market to affect how people end up in, saving for retirement and investing their retirement savings. And so studying that, I think, is an interesting topic. Then there's housing and associated mortgages, and I think within the household finance space, maybe this joint topic has probably received the most attention over the last 10 years, just because this historical link to people got interested in it because the 2008 financial crisis sort of originated in the in the consumer credit market. And so, there's a lot of aspects both in understanding housing markets, say the fact that all houses are unique, and therefore you want to think about the market as a search market, as well as on the mortgage side. There's obviously lots of aspects there, and then you can think about the rest of the household balance sheet. The last thing is durables, right? You can think about households own cars, households might own dishwashers and washing machines, etc. And then map to these durables as some categories of consumer credit. So we'll see we see Chris Palmer later on present a paper on car loan markets, right? So it's a it's a category of consumer credit to finance sort of the purchase of durables like cars. And then you have unsecured consumer credit, things like, borrowing on credit cards, borrowing on bank overdrafts, borrowing on payday lending. These are really, this is really most of the time borrowing that leads to immediate consumption and therefore doesn't really neatly line up with a corresponding asset on the household balance sheet. And you'll see that a lot of papers in today's presentation will focus on some of these categories of unsecured credit. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to have these 5 half-day topic classes. They're going to be always Fridays, 12:30 to 5:30 Eastern time. And again, the objective is to introduce you to some of the cutting edge research and some of the researchers that do this work within this household finance space. So the first session is going to be on October 2nd, that's today, and that's going to be on non-mortgage household borrowing. And then we have a session on peer effects in household finance. We're going to have a session on the determinants and effects of household expectations. We're going to have a session on mortgage borrowing and default. And then lastly, we're going to have a session on climate finance, trying to study the interaction of climate change and household financial situation. And that's going to close out this year, and then based on sort of what the demand looks like at the end of the year, we might also have a few more sessions next year on on some additional topics. Our plan is afterwards to release some of the slides and some of the recordings on our websites, but I just want to be upfront that this is all subject to approval by the individual presenters, etc. So if you want to make sure you get all the content, you really have to dial in to the presentations in real time rather than wait for the recordings and the slides. I know time zones make that not possible for everybody, but we just can only post stuff that we get approval to post. During the talk, so this is today's session. So again, we're doing the overview now, and once we're done, I'll present the first paper. Then Teresa will present a paper on the role of present bias in credit card debt paydown. I think actually then it's going to be Scott, so Scott and Christopher switch. So then Scott's going to talk about private information and price regulation in the US credit card markets. Michaela's going to talk about consumer debt and savings around retirement. So again, this retirement angle being important because of the life cycle dimension. Neil Mahoney is going to talk about the interactions between some of these frictions in consumer credit markets and sort of monetary and fiscal policy. And then at the end at 5 o'clock, what we'll have is a panel discussion with the presenters in today's session, where we'll talk about sort of what are other interesting research ideas, what are other interesting research directions from sort of our perspective, how do you get data in this space, etc. And because we have a relatively large number of you attending, we can't make the session extremely interactive. So what I would recommend you do is that throughout the day, when you have questions or you have ideas and topics that might be helpful to be discussed in this panel discussion at the end, that you put it in the Q&A. So not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And then, when we sort of have the panel and we talk about these topics, we can try and include as many of your questions as possible, though obviously, can't promise to get to all of them. Okay, so now consumer credit, right? So a little bit of the framing for today's session, before I dig in and talk about some of my own research in that space. So this is a graph that many of you have seen. The New York Fed Consumer Credit Panel puts it out every quarter, and it shows you, the total dollar amount of outstanding consumer debt, in the United States. So the first thing you see is this orange bar here, somewhere around, $10 trillion of debt is mortgages, right? So mortgages is by far the largest debt category on households' balance sheets. And so that explains why we're going to dedicate a separate session to the mortgage market. But then you can see that sort of this joint combination of student loans, credit card debt, and auto loans make up, several trillions worth of, outstanding debt as well. And, one thing to bear in mind is that, the welfare importance of each of these credit markets is not necessarily directly corresponding to the total outstanding size of these markets, right? So you could imagine that, some credit markets, say like payday loans, even though the total outstanding dollar volume in these markets might not be quite as large as, as in the mortgage market. The welfare implications of what's going on in that market might be very high because, the people that operate in that market might have, might be particularly vulnerable, or they might have particularly high margin utilities of consumption, etc. But overall, the total amount of, consumer credit outstanding in the US today is something like, 14.3 trillion US dollars. You can see that that's larger than it was at the peak of the financial crisis. So this is, we're talking really about an extremely large total dollar amount. This here's a graph I like a lot, from a paper by Mian, Sufi, and Werner. Again, this argument of why we should care about, about consumer credit. And again, the idea was, well, did consumer credit cause the Great Recession? And I think a lot of the evidence suggests that at least it had a very substantial role to play in doing it. And so what Mian, Sufi, and Werner do in this paper is they try and explore, a much more systematic overview of the relationship between, consumer credit and economic activity. So this is across, years globally, but they have similar graphs that they study across year countries. And what you can see here is that, following expansions in consumer debt to GDP, you subsequently have slower GDP growth down the road, right? So this link between what's going on the consumer credit side, which we're studying today, and macroeconomic activity. And again, this is sort of the thing that I think was new when Teresa and I were in grad school in 2008 and 2009. This was the moment when people started to realize that these households, while each of them might only, borrow a little bit, or you might not be that important. Once you aggregate them up, this really has large macroeconomic implications. And, that kind of got us interested and got a lot of other people interested in this field too. This is just from the New York Times around the time that, the Wall Street crashes, in 2008, September 2008. But, you've all heard the narratives about, how, the subprime mortgages that subsequently got securitized, etc., were at the heart of this. So really kind of why people got into this in the first place. So what are interesting questions in this space? I mean, I think a lot of them we'll address in today's presentation. So the first question that is interesting to me is, why are there credit constraints, right? This idea that you have this life cycle pattern of income, and sort of our models should tell us that, we should do consumption smoothing, but consumption smoothing is really hard because it's very hard for people to borrow. Why are there credit constraints? Well, the first one is that there's just not a lot of collateral in general. But the other aspect is that, these consumer credit markets have a huge amount of adverse selection and moral hazard. And so, both Scott Nelson and Neil Mahoney's presentations later in the afternoon will focus on highlighting, these elements of adverse selection and moral hazard and how they interact with credit markets. And I think that's sort of one very interesting sort of space within, within consumer credit. The second question is whether or not, given the sort of credit market we have, and given the frictions and given the credit constraints, are households behaving optimally in this market, right? Are they, behaving, is their borrowing behavior, for example, consistent with them optimizing their own welfare? And you see from the previous graphs, household borrow a lot, and so there's two alternatives. One of them is household borrow too much, right? And so the question is, what does too much mean, etc. But it could also be that, households borrow this much at high interest rates precisely because they want to do consumption smoothing. So really trying to understand whether or not the behavior we see in the data actually nicely aligns with optimal behavior is, I think, a really interesting research agenda. And so both Michaela Pagas and Teresa's presentations that you'll see today kind of really put these behavioral biases at the heart of what they're going to focus on. There's other things like search friction. So, Chris Palmer's presentation today is going to focus on these search frictions. And the idea here is that, turns out that there's huge price dispersion in credit markets, right? So the same individual, or very similar individuals sometimes pay very different interest rates, for example, for different loans. And the question is, why is that the case? And one of the explanations, they're just not searching enough. And then you can try and understand, why aren't they searching enough? Why aren't they comparing prices more, etc.? So Chris Palmer's presentation is going to focus on that. Then there's the question about how does, all this stuff, all these credit constraints, all this behavior, how does that affect aggregate economic outcomes and policy, right? And so Neil Mahoney's presentation today is going to focus on exactly this specific question. Now that you have these credit markets with, with adverse selection and moral hazard, etc., what does it do, for example, to the effectiveness of monetary policy? As he'll focus on specifically. Why monetary policy? Well, because monetary policy, in the way that it's meant to work, quite usually works through the consumer credit market. So the idea is the Fed reduces interest rates, right? And at these lower interest rates, to the banks, and then the banks, in the story will go and they will pass on these lower interest rates to their, to consumers. So now consumers pay lower interest on their credit card, which leaves them extra money to consume, or borrowing becomes more attractive at these lower interest rates, so they'll borrow more to consume more, etc. But again, the idea is that a reduction of interest rates stimulates the aggregate economy, stimulates consumption through its effect on household borrowing. And trying to figure out the extent to which this channel is hurt by things like moral hazard and adverse selection is going to be central to to Neil's presentation. And then lastly, really trying to think about how regulation in these markets might operate. Again, the idea that households might make quite a lot of mistakes in the way that they behave. In part because there's these behavioral biases that Michaela and Teresa will talk about in their presentations. That then opens the question about, well, if the households aren't behaving in a way that optimizes their own welfare, is there a role of government, right? Is there a role of regulation? And how does this regulation look? And how should that regulation look? And so this question is going to be central to both my presentations in a few minutes and also Scott Nelson's presentation in the afternoon. So these are, I think, all really interesting questions within the consumer credit space that we'll hear more about in today's presentations. There's a bunch of other really important questions that I just want to highlight at this point, because we don't and we won't have time to talk about these in a lot of detail, and they don't really show up in any of the presentations, not because they're not important, but really primarily because, we only have, a few hours there. So one, I think, really important question in space is really understanding the payday lending market. You'll see today's presentations focusing on, say, the credit card market and the car loan market. There's also, a bunch of people working on the payday lending market, and that's a really important, consumer credit market that we, won't go into a lot of detail today. Then there's a question about consumer bankruptcy, right? So you have this idea that households, they borrow a lot, and sometimes they borrow so much that they can no longer repay the totality of their debt. And so then the question is, well, what happens then? Now, most countries, all countries, have some, consumer bankruptcy regime, some consumer bankruptcy framework, some ability for households to get rid of their debts and kind of have a fresh start. But those systems differ dramatically across countries. So in the US, it's actually fairly generous. So when you go into bankruptcy, you get rid of all your debts. You can keep some assets, but then you really have a fresh start. In Europe, it works very different. So if you go into consumer bankruptcy in Europe, you will likely have to repay, those debts, for the rest of your life. And so, how to optimally design the system, what are the incentives, both to, to borrow too much upfront, but then also, if you're going to have to repay your loans for the rest of your life, what effects does that have on your willingness, to work hard, etc. That's, I think, a really interesting sort of set of questions that, people are working on. And again, we won't see much of that today. Then there's a dimensions, what is the effect of credit registries, right? So credit registries are sort of, systematic collection of your performance in credit markets that other banks can look at. So we talked a lot about, the role of adverse selection in this market. So when you show up to a bank, the bank doesn't really know whether or not, you're going to be someone who's likely to repay or someone who's not likely to repay. And one way to alleviate these credit frictions is through credit registries. In the US, they might end up, for example, pulling your FICO score, your credit score, and that credit score, provides a representation for, how likely you are to repay that debt. What is the effect of this type of information provision in consumer credit markets? Does it mean that more people get credit now? Does it mean fewer people get credit now? So I think there's a lot of interesting questions there. Again, I think Scott Nelson might touch on some of them, but I don't think we're going to see a lot of that today. And then there's this broader question about consumer credit and the macroeconomy. The work of Atif Mian, and Amir Sufi and many others that really tries to link the consumer credit side to the macroeconomy. Neil's presentation, linking it to monetary policy, will do a little bit there. But again, there's an entire research agenda, that links consumer credit. A lot of it is linking mortgage credit, but also unsecured credit. And then, I highlighted this already. The one sort of big asset and debt category we won't have time to talk about today, and also not in subsequent week, is student loans and the interaction with human capital acquisition. So the idea that, when you take out a lot of student debt, how does that affect what you study? So, does everybody have to become a lawyer or, study economics? Can people basically not afford to study music anymore? And then even condition on studying what careers you take, is the fact that you have to repay a lot of student debt. How does that affect your decision to maybe, become a public defender rather than some, high-paid corporate lawyer? So if there's a lot of really important discussions, within that space, interesting questions within that space. And again, these are not topics that we will have time to talk about. Today is going to be about sort of those types of questions that we have here.